Mecklenburg either. And for a lot of the world, when they hear the name Jesus, it's kind of the same thing. Oh, that guy we talk about at Christmas time. Maybe he comes up at Easter. I know he was a baby in a manger. I know that some people, have Easter egg hunts around the time of something else that he did, but that's about all the world seems to know about Jesus. He's kind of like any other celebrity. But Jesus invites us to get to know him even better. If you were buddies with Dikembe Mutombo, what would he be like? What's his personality? What would you do together? What kind of food does he like? What do you do when you're just hanging out? What do you talk about? If you get to know somebody, if you get to really know who they are, the struggles that they have, the thoughts that they have that they don't share with most everybody else. Jesus invites us as his followers to get to know him even better than the world knows him. Jesus, for us as Christians, as followers of him, as followers of Jesus, we ought to know him better. We ought to know who he really is. Because although he is a baby that was laid in a manger, and although that is an important part of his life, an important part of the gospel message, that's not all that he is. I'm sure there were other babies that were laid in mangers. There were other people who were hung on crosses. It wasn't an uncommon thing. The Roman Empire loved their crosses. They loved to torture people. They loved to put them to death to show their power. Jesus wasn't the only one. And if that's all there is to Jesus, then there's not much to get to know. And the Apostle Paul is somebody who knew Jesus. The Apostle Paul was that guy who wanted to persecute Christians. The Apostle Paul was that guy who had gotten permission to travel to arrest them, to make it his life's work, to put Christians in prison, and to even put them to death, I suppose was his plan. He stood there as Stephen was stoned, probably had some inspiration from that. And on that road to Damascus, after he had gotten his permission, after he was on his way to persecute Christians and make that his life's work, he got to meet Jesus. The Jesus that the world kind of knows as a celebrity, but Jesus met Paul face to face. Jesus met Paul and introduced himself to Paul in a way that nobody else got from Jesus. And he really got to know him. He learned from him. He learned who he was. And he shared that information with us in Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. And as we read these verses again, think about the Apostle Paul on the road to Damascus getting to meet Jesus after his death, after his resurrection, after his ascension to heaven. The Apostle Paul getting to know who Jesus really is and sharing that information with us. In Colossians chapter 1, starting at verse 15, I'm reading from the English Standard Version this time. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. As we read these passages, I hope you're following along. I hope that you pay close attention to what Paul is saying or the words that he chooses to use. Because Paul could have described Jesus in any number of ways, but in this short section where Paul is trying to get across to us exactly who Jesus is in just a few verses, this is what Paul chooses to say about him. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, Paul's going to go on and tell us the significance of that. Why is this important to us as Christians, as followers of Jesus? Because in verse 20, through him, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. This is the significance. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, firstborn of all creation, so that he can accomplish this purpose of reconciling the world. Our world is a mess. Our world is messed up. We have death, we have cancer, we have car accidents, we have loved ones falling and breaking hips on their way to see their relatives' baptism. We have all sorts of things that ail us and plague us and kill us in this world. And it takes Jesus to reconcile that problem, to bring peace to a world that is so distraught, that is so turned around, that is so upside down because of death and sin and the problems that they bring. And so the end of this passage is where Paul is telling us why this is important, but I want to focus this morning on the beginning of the passage where Paul is simply trying to tell us who Jesus is. Something so difficult for our minds to wrap around, and yet Paul uses these simple words saying, He is the image of the invisible God. In other words, He is the visible God. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 12, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 12, the Apostle John reminds us that no one has ever seen God, but if we will love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. Now, John's point is that he takes a fact that we all know, that nobody ever gets to see God. In fact, if you remember the story of Moses, remember Moses, how he asked God, "Can I see you?" And God says to Moses, "Nope, you can't, because if you did, you'd die. You drop dead because of my glory, because of my power. There's no way you could survive it. So instead, I'm going to put you inside of a cave, I'm going to cover the opening, and I'm going to pass by, and I'm going to let you see the back of my glory. Just a glimpse, just a little bit, as much as you can handle. But that's all I can show you, Moses." And other than that, nobody had really ever seen God, and Moses never really got to really see God. And so John takes this fact, and he says, we know that nobody has seen God. We know it hadn't happened yet. But when we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. In other words, John is saying, but when we see one another, and we see the love that we have for one another, we get a small picture of God. We get a glimpse at who God is. It's not the whole thing. It's just the back of his glory. It's just a little bit. But we get a glimpse into God. But in the book of John, same writer, same apostle, in John chapter 1, the Gospel of John this time, John uses that same phrase again, but this time he's talking about Jesus. On the one hand, he's saying, look around, look at your brothers and sisters, look at how you love one another. You see that love, you see little bit of God. But in the book of John, he's trying to explain that Jesus, who came in the flesh, showed us God in a way that nobody else can, in a way that not even we can when we show love to one another. That Jesus was the image of the invisible God. So he says in John 1, verse 18, no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Notice the language and the way that John uses these words. You have to pay close attention, but he says no one has ever seen God, in other words, God the Father. Not even Moses got to see him. But the only God, that is Jesus, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. In other words, John is saying no one gets to see God the Father, but when we see Jesus, it's about the same thing, because he makes him known. There's a word here that John uses to say that Jesus has made God known, and it's the word exegete. And it's the word that we get exegesis when we're talking preacher talk and we want to sound important and special. Then we'll talk about exegetical preaching and exegesis. And all that really means is that we're explaining what Scripture says. It's the type of preaching where you take Scripture and you explain what it means. That's just all exegesis is. But in the Greek language, to exegete means to reveal something. Like a mystery that was hidden, and you open it up, it's revealed. To let everybody see something. And so here's John saying of Jesus, when we look at him, when we see him walking, when we see him laying in the manger, when we see him hanging on the cross, when we see him healing the sick, when we see him helping the poor and those who are in need, when we look at Jesus, then God is revealed to us, a God that we can't see any other way, but that we can see in Jesus Christ. That's a pretty bold statement, right? Because we're told that Jesus is just an ordinary guy on the outside. We're like saying, hey, see that David Bell guy right there? Not that David's that ordinary, but see that David Bell guy right there? That's God. I mean, it'd be hard if you didn't believe it to believe it. And of course, John's point is to try to get us to believe, and he begins at the beginning of that passage talking about the Word and how it was made flesh, and we'll come back to that in a minute. He says a lot of things about Jesus here, but the thing that he says here at the end that's most important is that when we see Jesus, we are seeing God, and he is revealing him to us, a God that we can't see otherwise, a God that we won't see until that day comes when we are resurrected and we get to be with him forever, and our eyes will be changed, as John indicates in 1 John as well, and we'll finally get to see this God that we cannot see. But when we see Jesus, we get a glimpse of him, and not just a glimpse. The Hebrews writer in Hebrews chapter 1 says that Jesus is the exact imprint of his nature. He's the same as God, because he is God. He's more than just a baby lying in a manger. He's more than just a man on the cross. We, as followers of Jesus, are declaring that Jesus is our God. And so we obey, and so we serve him. And Paul wants to make sure that we understand, back in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. The firstborn of all creation. Firstborn here doesn't mean born first necessarily. It means that he's the heir. And we know the importance in biblical passages of firstborn. Jacob and Esau fighting over who was the firstborn and who was going to get the blessing and the inheritance. And here's Paul saying that Jesus is the firstborn, as in the one who is the heir, because he's the Son of God, the heir of all things, the one to whom all things belong. And just to make sure that we understand that, he says in verse 16, "For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him." I'm a graphic designer, web designer. That's what I do for a living. Have to understand copyright laws a little bit. Did you know you don't have to declare a copyright if you create something? Our laws say that if you made it, it belongs to you. And nobody else has the right to use that or take it as their own. If you make it, if it's a photograph, a painting, a piece of writing, if you made it, it belongs to you. That's all Paul is saying here. Jesus made our world. And again, John, back in John chapter 1, in verse 1, was saying the exact same thing when he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he wants us to think about Genesis chapter 1, when God spoke words and things came into existence. As John says, in the beginning was the Word, he expects us to remember that creation story and about how Jesus spoke words and things were made. And what John is really saying is, you know that the words that came out and created things, you know that power of creation? That is Jesus. Jesus is the Word. And he continues, the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so John, making sure we understand, he wants us to think about Genesis, says, oh, you remember when God created light? The first thing that he did? That was Jesus too. Jesus the Word. Jesus the power of creation. The Jesus the one who made all things. Now back in John's day and Paul's day, they had Greek philosophers who had these ideas about the gods and about powers in the world. And one of those ideas was this idea of the logos. Logos was their word for word. And it's kind of like the idea when we say the pen is mightier than the sword, or knowledge is power. They took that kind of idea to an extreme, and they made words and wisdom and knowledge almost into a god itself, into a magical thing. And they called it the Logos. And they didn't understand that they were trying to make, knowledge and power and wisdom into a god, and all along they were really talking about Jesus, the Word, the knowledge, the wisdom, the power of creation. They were almost there, and John says, you're almost there, but the Word that you're talking about, that wisdom, that power, that knowledge, that Word is Jesus. The one who became flesh in verse 14, John 1, verse 14, the one who became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John is saying, we have seen the power of creation, walking and talking. Shook his hand, hugged him, gave him a kiss, ate with him. Jesus in the flesh, the power of God to create. In the book of Colossians, you'll notice that he says several things about Jesus as a creator. He says that by him all things were created, at the beginning of verse 16 there, Colossians 1:16. By him all things were created. And then at the end of the verse, he says all things were created through him and for him. Now, I'm not going to tell you this morning that I understand the difference between by him all things and through him all things were created and for him all things were created, but I do understand that Paul is trying to help us to understand that no matter how you look at it, Jesus is the creator. Jesus made everything. He is the Word. He is the power of creation. By him all things are created, and through him and for him. And Paul will say something very similar in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 11. Starting in verse 33. Only this time he's talking about the Father, but notice the similarities. Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Paul wrote both of these passages. And Paul understood that somebody could come along and read both of these passages, both of these letters of his. And Paul is not making a mistake here. He wants us to see the similarity. He wants us to understand exactly what he's saying, and that's that the Father made all things, and that Jesus made all things, and that they are both the Creator, and that they are both God, and that we serve them both. This Jesus that we follow, the Jesus from which we get our name as Christians, Church of Christ, we've got to know him and who he is. And part of that is that he is God, the Creator, the one who made everything that we know and everything that we can't see. Paul in the book of Colossians here again says that he made all things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. That language he uses throughout Colossians and Ephesians to talk about a spiritual world that's all around us that we cannot see, but angels and demons and other spiritual beings that we can't even imagine that are around us right now, that have control in our world, that have power in our world. And God is saying the things that we can see, or Paul is saying the things that we can see, the things that we can't see, the things that our minds can hardly even grasp, all of that. The entire universe, the entire creation, all of it made by Jesus. He is the Creator. But it's one thing to believe in God or even Jesus being a creator, a being that made our world. But one of the unique things about Christianity is that we also believe that God is still active to sustain our world, that God is still holding our world together, that without him, our world would just fall apart, would spin out of existence. And the Bible repeatedly talks about this, about how the snow is stored up in the storehouses until God sends it out to fall, and the rains falling on the good and the evil alike, because God is blessing them all. All that language about how God takes care of the animals. Read through the book of Job. Job, can you take care of the lions, and can you take care of the mountain goats, and can you? I do all that, Job. God says to us over and over in Scripture. I do all that. I hold this world together. You only breathe and live because I allow you to, and because I give you that breath and that life on a daily basis, on a minute by minute basis, second by second. God is sustaining our world. Back in John chapter 8 again, John chapter 8. John records this interaction with Jesus and some Pharisees, some enemies of his. They're trying to trick him, trying to trap him. And along the course of this, they are saying, well, Abraham is our father, so we must be God's children. But we don't really know who you are, Jesus. We don't know what you represent. We're Abraham's children. And Jesus says to them, before Abraham was, I am. And he uses those two words, I am, that God used when he was speaking to Moses from the burning bush, when God says, when I go to the people of Israel and I tell them, who sent me? Who should I say? What's your name? Moses says to God. And God says, you just tell them that I am sent you. And Jesus uses that same phrase here, and he says to these enemies of his who are saying, who are you, Jesus? We're the children of Abraham. Who are you? Before Abraham was, I am. Amen. And what a declaration. He's saying, I am the God who spoke to Moses from the burning bush. I am in existence before Abraham was born. I am even from the beginning, Paul says in Colossians chapter 1. So again, continuing on in verse 17, he is before all things. He is before all things. The word here is before is a word for time. It just means that before there was anything, there was Jesus. Can't say that of anything or anybody but God. Before this world existed, before all things, there was Jesus. And from that point forward, in him, all things hold together. Again, I mentioned before, it's one thing to believe in a God who made the world. It's another thing to believe in a God who made the world and continues to hold it together. And you probably know that some of our founding fathers were known as deists. The founding fathers of our country were known as deists. They believe that God created this world and kind of wound it up like a clock and set it going. But that's not the kind of God that we serve. The kind of God we serve sends the rain and sends the snow and takes care of the lions and the mountain goats and you and me. And without him, our world would just fall apart. And Paul says that's Jesus. Verse 17, and in him all things hold together. In him all things hold together. Think about that for a moment. That man who walked in the dirt and ate with his disciples and helped the sick and hung on that cross and lay in a manger, the entire world was on his shoulders. The entire creation, the entire universe was on his shoulders. By his power, it was being held together and is held together to this day. In Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3, the Hebrews writer has a very similar section to Paul's here in Colossians, which leads some to believe that Hebrews writer was Paul. I'm not going to argue with them because I don't know for sure. But the Hebrews writer says some very similar things in chapter 1, verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, the firstborn, that Paul called him, through whom also he created the world. Paul talked about that. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. Paul said the image of the invisible God. And he upholds the universe. It's talking about Jesus. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. When we think about who Jesus is, this Jesus that we serve, the Jesus that calls us brother, by the way, the Jesus that calls us friend, the Jesus who put his life on the line and hung on that cross for us, that Jesus is the one who holds our entire universe together by the word of his power. He speaks and it happens. That's the Jesus that we serve. That's the Jesus that we follow. Only God has that kind of power. And Paul is trying to give his audience hope because they're going to face some tough times. They're going to face some ridicule. They're going to face family turning against them. They're going to face persecution. Some of them are going to die for their faith. And he's trying to remind them, as he is us today, that the Jesus that we serve, the one that we get our name from as Christians, Church of Christ, the Jesus that we claim to follow, is the God of the universe. And if he is the God of the universe, then no matter what you've done, and no matter how bad it gets, and no matter how messed up our world is, he can fix it. And he will fix it. No matter how we grieve, and no matter how much we lose, he'll wipe every tear from every eye. And no matter what happens to you, if you put your faith in Jesus, and if you follow him, even if you die, yet shall you live. One day, if you die before Jesus comes back, you're going to come back to life. And you're going to live forever with him. Because the Jesus that we serve, the Jesus who hung on that cross, is also the Jesus that came back from the dead, who ascended to heaven, who sits on the right hand of the throne of God, who has the power of creation and the power to sustain the world and the power to reconcile all things and the power to bring peace to those of us who really need it. And so this morning, that's the invitation that I offer you. If you need peace, if you need relief, if you need comfort, if you need help, I want to be honest with you, we're not a lot of help because we're just human beings. But we serve one and we follow one who is Jesus, our God, Jesus, our Creator, Jesus, our Sustainer, who can sustain you. And if you would like his help this morning, we invite you to come and let us know how he can help you while we stand and sing.